Montreal International Game Summit 2015. Bienvenue au Sommet international du jeu de Montréal 2015.
Hello, everyone. I'm Vernon Harmon. I'm a technical account manager with Sony Computer Entertainment. And the name of my talk is Embrace Virtual Reality with PlayStation VR. So it kind of gives you a little hint about what we're here to talk about today. When I was here last year, I spoke about the first year of the PS4 and where we plan to go for the second year. Well, yesterday, yesterday was the PS4's second birthday, at least here in North America, and we're still going strong. But rather than talk about what we've done for the last year this time around, I'm going to focus on some new experiences that the PS4 plays a central role in delivering.
PlayStation.
All right. So as the video said, PlayStation VR is coming next year, and developing compelling VR content is both an exciting and a different kind of challenge than game developers are accustomed to. So later in the talk, we'll look a little bit more at what the technical challenges are for VR, as well as the specs and the specific advantages of PSVR. But let's start off by examining why developing for VR requires a distinct change in thinking. So throughout the history of visual media, it's always been experienced through a window or on a screen. And content creators have always sought a more immersive experience, despite the inherent limitation of being on the outside looking in to the experience. This has led to the development of things like IMAX and surround sound. It led to the development of first-person cameras in games, as well as stereoscopic rendering and 3D video. VR breaks this windowed model and introduces true presence. Now, you're in the scene and in the world. There's no void and no gap between the user and the window, and you can get up close and personal with the objects and the actors in the environment. And yes, this does actually change a lot about the knowledge and the assumptions that we as game developers have been operating with for quite some time. So let's talk a little bit about the concepts that you need to keep in mind as you're developing content for VR. Player comfort and safety is a hugely important part of VR development. So how many of you here have actually tried VR before? Yeah, okay, quite a few of you, all right. So what was your first experience like, right? Was it comfortable? Was it what you expected it to be? Was it kind of intense, right? For most of us, this image kind of captures how we felt after that first experience, right? So developers need to design with that first experience in mind. So unlike traditional gaming, VR gaming is often the first exposure that a user has had to a VR experience, and it can be a very intense and jarring experience. We also need to be conscious of longer play sessions because they may be very fatiguing, either physically, mentally, or even just for the eyes. Short sessions, you should even still be conscious of the duration and the intensity and frequency of the interactions that the player has. Everyone, and I think probably goes for most of us in this room, who's had a poor VR experience knows what I mean when I say simulator sickness, right? There are things that you can do and things that you can avoid doing in order to minimize the potential for uncomfortable experiences. Player fears and emotional reactions become very significant in virtual reality, and we'll talk about that in just a moment. And the player in virtual reality is having an experience that's overriding a lot of what they can actually sense in the world, which potentially puts them in physical jeopardy. So it's best to design a seated VR experience and not to encourage rapid and wild head movements and arms moving around and things like that. So traditionally, the player character can do some pretty wild and crazy things and be put in some very harrowing situations. The player experiences the game world vicariously through that avatar, and we generally do our best to try and get the player to empathize with the avatar character. But in a first-person VR experience, you're actually putting the player in those situations, not just vicariously through the character, but actually as the avatar itself. So doing this actually exposes the player a lot more directly to the experiences and the gameplay. Threats can feel a lot more real, and they can trigger some very strong responses from players. Now, in a non-VR game, a player might easily cross a rope bridge that's over a lava-filled gorge and barely register any threat whatsoever to the character or to themselves. But in VR, the same sequence could be very intense with a sense of height and a real sense of personal danger. It's important to recognize this difference and design experiences for the player's sensibilities, not for the character. So due to that strong sense of presence, player reactions in first-person VR experiences are much more like real-life reactions than those of the traditional game player. This sense of presence can be fairly overwhelming, especially for new players. And if you were here for Ben's talk, the previous talk in this room about keep talking and no one explodes, he talked a lot about the difference in the experience for initial users and more experienced players as well. In general, presence can be thought of as an emotional amplifier, right? The ability to inhabit the avatar in the game world, get up close and interact directly with objects and other characters can feel very real. This is particularly true of fear and anxiety. VR can trigger the sensation that something is lurking just out of sight, or that the user needs to be extremely cautious and wary of what's going on much more easily than in traditional gameplay, because the player is more likely to feel like the experience is real. Now, because the VR player is present in the game world, it becomes much more important to satisfy player expectations, or that illusion gets shattered. For example, if the player can see their hands and there are objects that they could expect to pick up, they need to be able to pick them up. Now, these expectations can come from real life or from games or even from VR. So if you think about the ever-present crate example, right? In a non-VR game, it might be enough to simply touch the crate or push a button when you're near it in order to get what's inside the crate. But in VR, the player can reasonably expect to actually have to physically break open the crate, reach down, grab the object, pick it up, and use it. And it becomes even more important to conduct a lot of user testing to understand exactly what it is that the user expects. Now, some expectations might even be subconscious. For example, if a player is moving, their brain actually expects some deceleration when they stop moving. If player movement just stops abruptly without any sort of believable deceleration, it can be very jarring. You need to be careful with your assumptions, though. You might make the assumption that bobbing the camera around when you're walking, like a lot of games do in non-VR experiences, might be what your brain would expect in a walking situation. But if you're not actually moving your head and walking around, it can be very disorienting and cause simulator sickness. So when something occurs in virtual reality and it doesn't actually satisfy player expectations, we call that a mismatch. So you might reasonably think that in virtual reality, an important part of the designer's job is to get rid of all of the mismatches, right? Well, the problem is the game controls what the player sees and what the player hears, but mismatches are inevitable. There are things that are just going to not match up. For example, the player's body posture might not match the avatar's body posture. The player won't feel any sort of motion cues. If you're turning, pulling G-forces, that's not going to happen. Contact points with the seat, the headset, the headphones, the controller, those are always going to be felt, whether they actually map to anything in the game or not. Heat, Cold, wind, smell, touch, taste, all these things are not simulated in the virtual reality, and real instances of these may actually interrupt that sense of presence for you. The player is not going to feel any sort of resistance when swords clash together or they reach out to touch an object that only exists in virtual reality. And one of the more obvious ones, in virtual reality, locomotion is generally performed, at least in some part, through abstracted controls, not by one-to-one movement of our feet and walking around. Now, that one-to-one match is a big part of what actually creates presence, because we're trying to give the player what they expect. So while we can't eliminate mismatches, our goal is to minimize the disruption that those mismatches cause and to match expectations one-to-one whenever possible. If we take the scenario here, for example, sky falling, there's clearly a mismatch in the body posture and the contact points. But simply having the player lean forward slightly or maybe incline their head a bit might be enough to reinforce the notion of presence and disrupt some of those mismatches. Now, using a first-person camera with virtual reality is a fairly intuitive design, but you do need to be careful as a designer. Because the sense of presence in a first-person experience is very deep, it really feels like you're in the virtual world. At the same time, because it's so deep, anything that disrupts that is a potential breakage of the presence. For example, under typical gameplay, you come up to a door, collision detection prevents you from actually going through the door. But in virtual reality, if you're doing head-tracked movement, you walk up to the door, there's absolutely nothing to stop you from leaning forward like this and sticking your head right through the door. Now, this is just one example, but there can be a lot of issues like this that you need to solve depending on what your game is like. So even a slight sense of presence can be strong enough that the player acts as if the world is real. And when they're focusing all of their attention on their gameplay activities and what's directly in front of them, the brain can actually interpret the virtual surroundings as being real and react accordingly. So you need to be careful not to direct your players into situations where they might fall over or collide with real-life objects because they don't realize consciously that what they're interacting with is not there. Because of this, we strongly advise PSVR developers to build their games around seated experiences, as I mentioned before, to maximize player safety. Now, when you think about a first-person game, what do you expect from the UI? Typically, it's a screen overlay of some sort, but this does not really work for virtual reality since there's no longer a screen, right? The optics are right up in front of your eyes. So the window is gone now. You're immersed in the world, and you need a new approach. So arm's length is generally a pretty good approach. Now, you might be tempted to take that arm's length HUD and attach it to the player's head because that's sort of what you're expecting. The camera is the player's head. This is generally a pretty bad idea. So if I were to stand perfectly still, I can look around the room with just my eyes if I wish, but most likely I'm going to start to track something with my eyes and follow with my head until what I'm looking at is in the center of my vision, right? The predominant location for human vision is centered and aimed slightly down. So I'm generally going to be looking about right where this guy's sitting, okay? So if you attach your HUD to the head, right, and your head tracking, and you move your head, I want to look at something over here, and I go to look at it, and I turn my head, the HUD's now over here, and I'm playing cat and mouse, chasing it around, right? Okay, this is not a good experience. What that means is the HUD exists here, and the player is then forced inside of whatever the VR headset is to actually use their eyes to look around in the HUD, which is an extremely fatiguing experience for your eyes. All right? So, floating UIs feel a lot more natural. They should be linked to the player's body. So at arm's length, linked to the player's body, I can actually look around like this and see the elements of the HUD. If I turn, they're still relative to where I'm at, and I can look around as well. Okay? So a third-person viewpoint doesn't offer the same depth of immersion as first person. Rather than fully inhabiting the avatar, the player is actually present with the avatar in the situation. But because of this, it's actually harder to break the player's sense of presence. Mismatches are generally a lot less disruptive for a third-person camera experience. However, you do need to be careful when you're dealing with camera collision detection and if you have to reset because you get stuck, because that will definitely break the immersion, and it can be an extremely frustrating and disorienting experience for the player. For the best experience, we recommend that you map camera movement onto a control stick and use head tracking just for the look around. So you control where the camera actually goes, but as the player looks around, the camera tracks. All right? Now you might be tempted, in a third-person perspective, to try and have the camera orbit the avatar, so the character's always in the middle of the screen. All right? So if the camera were or if the avatar were here and the camera were looking at it, and I were to turn my head, the camera would swing around in orbit like this, so that it's looking still at the avatar. That's generally an extremely disorienting experience. So save yourself the time and don't try and do that. If you do, it can be done, but it takes a lot of really complicated finessing to really get that to be a good experience in most cases. You should avoid artistic camera effects, so depth of field, zoom, focal length changes, all those sorts of things. They don't contribute to presence. They can generally be pretty disorienting, so don't bother with those. But most importantly, never take control of the player's head. All right, and when I say that, I mean don't change the orientation of the camera unless the player's head moves. All right, if I'm standing here like this, my view shouldn't suddenly start shifting around. That's extremely disorienting, and in most cases, for a lot of people, will cause simulator sickness. So we've covered 6 key points when it comes to creating VR content. First, player comfort and safety are priority number 1. And that's a duty that we have as VR creators, that they have a trust in us not to make them sick, and we should live up to that. VR is not an interactive movie. All right? The window is gone, the player is now present in the world, and the player's perceptions and emotions need to be considered more than what the character would be experiencing. In order to maintain the illusion of presence, the player expectations need to be satisfied whenever possible, and identifying those expectations and what breaks them is probably going to take a lot of iteration and testing with a lot of different users. The deeper the sense of immersion, the more susceptible it is to disruptions from mismatches. Unfortunately, mismatches are inevitable, so their effects need to be mitigated and minimized as much as possible. And finally, never take control of the player's head. So now that we have a better sense sort of how VR changes the conversation with regards to game design, let's talk a little bit about what it takes to actually deliver that strong sense of presence. So now it may come as a surprise to some of you, since we're talking about giving the player what they expect as one of our big 6 points, but photorealism is not a requirement for presence. So presence is more about how the world feels and responds to the player, not just how it looks. In fact, abstract, surreal, and highly stylized environments can all deliver a very strong sense of presence if your head and hand movements are accurately tracked and reproduced in the environment, the scale of the world and the way it behaves meets player expectations, and mismatches are minimized. And this is the key. Even if the world is something completely alien to the player is going to have expectations that need to be met in order to maintain this sense of presence. Now, as we said at the beginning, a key element of creating presence is breaking free of the window and tricking the brain by putting more of the world into your visual field. So we achieve this in PSVR with optics in the VR headset that deliver a field of view of about 100 degrees. Now, having a wider field of view brings us to the first of our technical considerations. A wider field of view means more displayed in the scene, and that means you're going to achieve less with your culling in your scene. Now, presence is not just visual. A surprising number of audio cues are processed by the brain in order to understand your surroundings. So achieving presence through audio requires a few things. The sound needs to be convincingly outside of the player's head. It needs to match the position of visual objects, and it needs to move correctly in parallax with the head's rotation. This is particularly effective with environmental sounds that you wouldn't consciously notice. So I'm going to take a moment here just to try something. I want everybody to close your eyes for just a moment and just listen to the background sounds that you have around you. So you can hear my voice coming out of the speakers. You might be able to hear some sounds from the hallway or maybe some from the room next door. You might be able to hear your own clothing or your chair maybe moving a little bit. You might be able to hear the person behind you fiddling with their phone or typing on their laptop or scratching their ear. Okay? Now move your head just a little bit one way or the other, maybe up and down very slowly. And notice how the sounds are still locatable, right? These are the kinds of subtle audio cues that reinforce presence. Okay, you guys can open your eyes now. Thank you. Nobody fell over, that was good. So PSVR comes with built-in support for 3D binaural audio that simulates the acoustic properties of the human ear and how sounds are spatially processed by the brain. Now, any standard headphones will work for PSVR, but it's not the same thing as surround sound. Okay, this is true spatial sound with object-based audio that renders sounds with positions and orientations that are relative to the user. And a large number of these virtual speakers are supported, so you can generate a lot of these environmental sounds that we were just talking about to create this rich sense of presence. Now that we can see and hear everything correctly, we need to be able to interact. Right? So a tracking system is required. In order to meet these player expectations of tracking, we need tracking that is accurate and responsive. Now, with PlayStation VR, we have just such a tracking system, surprise, that utilizes the PlayStation camera in conjunction with the VR headset and the DualShock 4 and PlayStation Move controllers. So in order to enable an unlimited field of view, the player has to be able to look around in complete freedom. In order to accommodate this, we use a tracking system to detect head orientation and position. The VR headset has onboard accelerometers and gyros, plus 9 LEDs that are tracked by the PlayStation camera. So let's take a look at how these all function together to create a tracking experience. Now, imagine that this is the head movement that we're trying to detect. Okay? Now, the data from multiple accelerometers and gyros are sampled at a high frequency, and they're fused together to give this effect. Now, the high-frequency motion is definitely being captured here, but if you look carefully, you'll notice that the overall view is slightly off, and it is drifting a little bit over time. Now, the camera is detecting motion at a lower frequency. In reality, it's 60 hertz, up to 60 hertz. The data has a lot more latency than the accelerometer and gyro data, but it is accurately capturing the movement with no drift. So PSVR uses software to fuse these two types of data together in order to give you the best of both worlds. Here we have accurate, low latency, high frequency tracking with no drift. But the PlayStation camera is not used just to fix drift. It provides accurate positional tracking too. It can track individual points of light using the parallax from the stereoscopic camera in order to detect depth. This is how it tracks the peripherals such as the DualShock 4 and the PlayStation Move as well as the VR headset. Once you add in accelerometer data from the devices, you can use that to supplement the camera data and increase the frequency and reduce the latency as we saw in the previous frame. Now, supporting tracked controllers allows us to track the player's hands one-to-one and provide intuitive control schemes. The player expects to be able to reach out and interact with the world, and he can. Now, I spoke earlier about inevitable mismatches, and one of the things that I mentioned was that you'll always feel the seat if you're sitting down, the headset, the earphones, and the controllers. But when those contact points actually map real-world sensations to in-game actions, like holding an object or wearing a helmet, rather than creating a mismatch, you now reinforce that sense of presence. And whether you have tracked controllers, they not only correspond one-to-one with the game world, they also feel solid in your hands. Now with PSVR, we've got simplified and unified tracking support. Up to 4 devices can be tracked simultaneously in the same coordinate space. So the VR headset and any combination of DualShock 4s and PlayStation Moves. As you can see from this sampling, There are a lot of different combinations of tracked controllers that can give you a number of different multiplayer configurations. And this isn't even taking into account that you can have a second screen control experience on a mobile device that's used as additional control inputs. And also, this is only local control configurations. You could have networked situations that introduce more combinations with other VR headsets and controllers. So, tracked controllers present a lot of new opportunities for interaction. Seeing the controller can be very helpful and incredibly immersive. You can actually put control hints and prompts right onto the controller itself, and the player can see them in virtual reality. As they press a button, you can see it depress in virtual reality. The combination of the VR headset, touchpad, and motion sensors can give you a wide range of interactions. You can take DualShock 4 and map that onto an object that you have picked up, and you can physically rotate it and look at the object in VR, or you can move your head around and look at it. You can use the touchpad in order to rotate the object that way or to flick objects out of it. There's also opportunities to do a lot of augmentation to the controllers. For example, you could take a DualShock and you could virtually plug it into some handlebars and then use that as a control mechanism. Or you can augment the controller in any way that you like. The key point here is that one-to-one tracking is very responsive due to the camera and the sensor data fusion. Now, when we go back to talking about presence, I just mentioned responsive tracking. A key component of that is latency. So what is latency? Latency is the time interval between initiating an action and experiencing the system's response. High latency can lead to some uncomfortable effects. That's generally simulator sickness. So what we're targeting generally is to aim for the lowest possible perceptible latency. Excuse me. So is there a way to reduce actual end-to-end latency and not just perceptible latency? Well, the view projection matrix is stored in GPU shader constants. So we can stall the GPU, update the state, and then signal the GPU to continue rendering. In this case, the amount of latency that you can remove is the time between when you sample the tracking data at the start of your CPU frame to when those results are actually used to render in the GPU frame. And at 60 hertz, which is about a 16 millisecond frame, you can probably eliminate at least 4 milliseconds of latency this way. This is generally referred to as late latching sensor data. All right, that's not too bad, but can we do even better? I wouldn't be asking the question if it was no, right? So, yes, hey, we can. So, the sensors in the headset, as we talked about before, operate at a much higher frequency than your frame rate. And great advantage of PSVR is that it's a closed system. You know what hardware you're actually working on. So it runs on a PS4. It runs the VR headset. We know the latency of the hardware. We know the latency of the software that's involved. And you know the latency of your rendering. So you can take all that latency information, combine it with updated tracking data, and somewhat fairly accurately predict the position and orientation of the tracked sensors at the time of scan-out. Now, there is a potential issue with this if you do early frame culling. If you late latch data, your geometry might get culled near the edges of your field of view. And then once your tracking data is updated, now it should be rendered, right? But you can actually alleviate some of this by using prediction with your initial tracking data that you sample as well in order to predict where it will be later in the frame. All right, so this leads us to the next requirement for presence, high frame rate, which is very closely related to latency. PSVR outputs 1080p at 120 hertz. Now, a lot of mobile titles and smaller experiences are easily capable of this. I've even seen some titles, I saw one title that was running at 500 hertz when it didn't have VSync on. Probably very uncommon, but it's certainly capable of happening. But if you have a so-called AAA experience, or you really want to push the boundaries on the visual side of things, you might be thinking to yourself, 120 hertz, that is really setting the bar high. Unfortunately, it's not much of an option for VR. So In the virtual reality experience, if you start dropping frames, it doesn't just disrupt the sense of presence. It can cause some serious discomfort. So mostly 60 FPS is not good enough. A solid 60 is really the bare minimum for a good VR experience. Okay, so 60 frames a second, we're looking at about 16.6 milliseconds per frame that I've got to render, right? Okay, that's challenging. Well, hang on there. There's actually a little bit of system overhead that's involved, so you're probably going to be looking at around 15 milliseconds or maybe even slightly less than that in order to hit 60 frames per second. Oh, and rendering at 60 probably is going to cause some discomfort, so we probably shouldn't be targeting 60. We suggest you hit at least 90, if not 120. Now, if you haven't done any VR development yet, you might not have thought about it much, but VR is actually stereoscopic. Each eye sees a slightly different image. So your renderer has to support multi-camera rendering. For PSVR, the resolution is 1920 by 1080, but that's 960 by 1080 per eye. So once you get your renderer modified to support multi-camera rendering, you'll need to fix up and remove any of the broken effects that occur, generally view-dependent effects and screen space effects. Now, a naive implementation of stereo rendering might work, depending on how complicated your game is. So you're looking at rendering each of the eyes separately in sequence, but you're submitting all your geometry twice. It's really not great for depth-only rendering, and you're really eliminating a lot of the benefits that you can get from the caches, particularly shader constants and textures are not going to take full advantage of the cache. So you're really limiting yourself a lot there from a performance standpoint. So what can we do about that? Well, there's a slightly different approach to stereo rendering called multi-slice rendering. Now, it's a more efficient way to do stereo rendering. You allocate your render targets with 2 slices or planes, and you adjust your vertex shaders to render to a target slice. At the beginning of each frame, you fill out the slice constant buffer for the left and the right eye. So you would set the constants for the left eye, draw a mesh on the left slice, set the constants for the right eye, and now render the same mesh on the right slice. Now, the benefits of this change are very scene and renderer dependent, so I don't have any actual numbers for the kinds of improvements that you can see, but it can be rather significant. Now, if your renderer doesn't already support stereo rendering and you're going to do VR, it's best to implement this approach right out of the gate, just in case you need that extra performance and you don't have to go back and try and redo everything. So all this talk of 120 hertz stereo rendering may have you thinking about how you're going to speed up your frames. You might think to yourself, well, I'll get rid of anti-aliasing, it's kind of expensive. That's not such a good idea. Noisy images are going to lead to poor user experiences, and in actuality, anti-aliasing is one of the things that you want to maximize in order to get the best user experience. You might think, oh, I can lower my shadow quality a little bit. That's also not a great idea. It's going to lead to a lot of aliasing, and as we just said, you really want maximum aliasing for a good experience. So you might also think, well, okay, I can sacrifice a little bit in terms of resolution, right? Yeah, well, that's not such a great idea either. Blurry images can lead to poor user experiences, but when it comes down to the bottom line, good anti-aliasing ends up being more important than native resolution. So if you need to sacrifice one or the other, you can sacrifice a little bit on the resolution, but keep your anti-aliasing solutions amped up as much as possible. All right, great. So, that's thanks for telling us what we can't do, right? That's mildly helpful. But how about what you guys can do? All right, so first of all, are you running triple buffered? If you are, get rid of it. Double buffered is the only way to go really in VR. As I said previously, photorealism is not necessary. And as I've alluded to throughout the talk here and there, a lot of graphics effects that have become somewhat standard in game development are either ineffective in VR or can actually produce some discomfort. So other than reducing the complexity of your scenes, the best thing that you can do is take a good look at all of your effects and make sure you're actually getting good bang for your buck. Because we've made player comfort a priority, hitting your frame rate needs to trump lots of fancy graphic effects. Now, one more way to improve your frame rate is reprojection. Reprojection is a 2D operation where a rendered image is moved to a new location on the screen. So let's take a look at what reprojection actually is. So it's been used in graphics for a number of years. Basically, you render the scene at one rate and you scan it out at a different rate. Okay? So the process of reprojection is here. First, you sample your sensor data before your rendering starts. You render your frame as usual. Then you sample your sensor data again as late as possible in your frame. And then finally, you shift your pixels to reflect the more recent data. Now, the green line here represents what's actually seen by the end user on the screen. So if you notice, there is some extra screen space around the edges here. And in order to avoid that, you do need to render a bit beyond your actual screen coordinates in order to accommodate reprojection. So why is reprojection relevant here? Well, reprojection helps reduce perceived latency and increases the perceived frame rate. In PlayStation VR, reprojection is supported at the system level using a lightweight asynchronous compute shader that runs on the GPU on the PS4. It should only take a small amount of GPU time, and it should have very little impact on your game performance. Now, as mentioned before, reprojection is a well-researched technique, and the issues and challenges associated with it are fairly well known, as well as some workarounds for some of the issues. Let's take a closer look at how reprojection actually affects your perceived latency and frame rate. So here, we're doing a render and scan out at 60 Hertz with no reprojection. So as you can see, we have the CPU task in blue, GPU task in orange, and a VR tracker task that's running asynchronously on the GPU. Now, although your VSync is running around 16.6 milliseconds per frame, as discussed earlier, you've actually got a little less than that in order to complete your rendering. Now, at a 60 Hertz refresh rate, screen persistence matters more to human perception. Persistence is basically the length of time that each pixel remains lit. At 60 Hertz, high persistence, where the pixels stay lit for longer, can cause blurring and smearing of the images, which is not a great experience for the player. And at a low persistence, say less than 3 milliseconds, that can result in a noticeable flicker because the pixel dims before the next image is actually drawn, which is equally bad. This is why rendering and scanning out a game at 60 Hertz really is not viable for a good VR experience. So now let's look at rendering at 60 Hertz with reprojection at 120. Now here, we see the same CPU and GPU processing, the VR tracker asynchronous thread running on the GPU. We also see now an asynchronous reprojection thread running on the GPU as well. Note that it's asynchronous, so it's not affecting your GPU performance. Now in the first frame here, the green block is going to reproject the frame that was rendered previous to that, updated with new sensor data. All right? Then the second frame, it takes the newly rendered data, gets updated sensor data for that as well, and reprojects that onto the screen. Okay? So this is the best compromise of getting a good chunk of time for doing your frame calculations, your rendering, and still getting some low latency. And it can actually feel pretty close to 120 native, depending on how your game is designed. So possible configurations for asynchronous reprojection on PSVR are rendering at 60 and reprojecting at 120, rendering at 120 and reprojecting at 120, and rendering at 90 and reprojecting at 90. Now wait a minute here. Why would you actually render and scan out at the same frequency? Well, let's take a look at that. So in this case here, your game is rendering and scanning out at 120 Hertz without any reprojection. So you've got less than 8 milliseconds to finish your render. The latency here is definitely much lower than what you would achieve at a 60 Hertz render. Here, we're looking at rendering at 120 and reprojecting at 120 as well. Now here, you sample your sensor data early in the frame with some prediction. Then you late latch your updated sensor data, again with prediction, before you do your render. And finally, you take the result of your render and you reproject that based on the absolute latest sensor data that you can get for the frame. This is going to be our best situation for latency and produce the fewest visual artifacts as well. All right, so let's say you're really attached to those fancy visual effects that you have, and you're thinking, oh, okay, well, I can render at 60 and squeeze in a couple more visual effects and then reproject to 120, right? That sounds like a win. Well, reprojection is not a catch-all, right? There are some caveats to it. It's only a 2D operation that's performed on your final rendered image. It knows absolutely nothing about what's going on in your scene, all right? So if the camera is moving, or there are objects in the scene that are moving, those are not going to be reprojected. They're just going to be moved, all right? Some of that, like camera movement, can be mitigated a little bit with some matrix composition, but this is really tricky and it's very imperfect. Additionally, fast-moving objects can end up getting double framed if you're moving the head at the same time when you're doing reprojection. So if you can hit 120 natively, that's definitely going to be a better experience than doing 60 and reprojecting to 120. So let's go summarize what we've learned a little bit about achieving a sense of presence. One of your goals needs to be keeping latency to a minimum, right? So you want to late latch your sensor data, use prediction as much as possible. Keep your frame rate high and consistent. Dropping any frames whatsoever will lead to a poor user experience. You want to reduce your scene complexity as much as possible. Use reprojection as much as possible. Drop any unnecessary effects, but don't diminish your anti-aliasing. You want to use 3D audio and incorporate that into your content authoring pipeline from the very beginning. And you want to capitalize on the one-to-one tracking of your VR headset and the controllers. So now that we know a bit about how to achieve presence in VR and how to think about designing for presence, no matter how strong the presence is, PSVR is not just about putting on the VR headset and having a solitary experience. It's really been designed to be social. We believe it's important that other people in the room can see what the player is seeing in a way, though, that makes sense to them, not just displaying left and right eye views with some distortion and crazy effects on it, showing a typical 2D television image. So with PSVR, we call this the social screen. All right? So this lets non-VR players in the room with a VR player experience and participate in the VR experience with the player. This is a socially involved and shared experience. So they have a common reference point after a VR experience that they can discuss. You can have asymmetrical play experiences where the users who are in VR and not in VR are trying to achieve different goals. And you can incorporate PS4 controllers or second screen controllers on mobile devices as well. Create a lot of rich creative opportunities, as we saw on the previous slide a way back, where we saw the big matrix of all the different track controller combinations that you could try and use. Now, up until recently, the social screen has just mirrored the non-VR image of what the VR player is seeing. But recently we added support for a second social screen mode, which we call separate screen. And here's a sneak peek of a game called Monster Escape, which is developed by Japan Studios. In this case, the VR player is controlling a monster, and up to 4 other players in non-VR are playing with DualShock 4 controllers on the separate screen in order to try and defeat the monster. Now, the VR player controls the monster's actions with head movements in order to try and smash buildings and dodge things that are thrown at them and such. So the view on the left-hand side here is what the VR player sees in the headset. The view on the right-hand side is a completely separate image that's rendered just for the TV players. All right, so let's try and bring this all together and really sell what makes PSVR so exciting. Let's start by revisiting the specs. So PlayStation VR's headset and the VR experience overall, you've got approximately 100 degrees wide field of view, 5.7-inch custom OLED optics with 1920 by 1080 resolution, 120 hertz refresh rate. Got full positional tracking, 360 degrees, position and orientation due to the 9 LEDs and the sensors that are included in the headset and being tracked by the PlayStation camera. You've got true spatial sound via regular headphones. You've got social screen experiences, both mirrored and separate modes. And you have an ergonomic design that, not to toot our own horn, but we hear it's the best from most of the people who've tried it. So beyond just the specs, PSVR offers a few other unique advantages in the VR space. As we've mentioned previously, there's a fixed spec platform that it operates with, the PS4. It's a known entity, and you know what you're going to actually be working with when you're developing your VR experience. We have an established controller interface with DualShock 4 and PlayStation Move, operating with the PlayStation camera as well as the headset itself. There's a strong PS4 install base. I think it's actually 29.3 million was the last public number that we had. I've had trouble trying to keep the slide up to date, actually. So that's going great. We also have an established content marketplace, right? So the PlayStation Store is a known place where you can go and get digital content. If there's VR content, you know where to find it. You can download it, play it right away. And of course, Sony is an established brand. You know what you're getting when you're buying something from Sony. We also have very good relationships with our developers. So speaking of developers and development, we want to touch a little bit on middleware that supports PlayStation VR. So we have broad engine and 3D audio support from major players in the middleware fields. So as we talked before, 3D audio is pretty essential to getting good presence experience. And FMOD and WWIs both support 3D audio libraries, our 3D audio libraries for PSVR. In terms of UE4, the source is available for free. We've got a strong PS4 community on the Unreal forums, and the latest version of the Unreal engine supports all of the key PSVR features. In terms of Unity, once you register to become a PlayStation developer, you'll get access to the latest version of Unity Pro, and the really cool part of that is it's free for PlayStation developers. So just to clarify that, if you are already a licensed Unity developer and you don't have access to Unity Pro, once you become a PlayStation developer, you then get access to it. All right, so to sum it up, you've got a powerful gaming console with established specs, right, and some great tools. We've got established input methods, we've got a state-of-the-art VR headset, and we've got high-quality VR content, and you know where to find it and how to buy it. All we need now is people to keep making that content, right? So we're looking for people who are interested in making cool stuff for VR, and now you guys are all experts, right? So if you want to become a developer, I've got a note on the next slide on how to do that, but I do need to have a small disclaimer here for legal reasons. PSVR will not work on horses or other non-human animals, okay? Just make that clear. But that is the kind of outside-the-box thinking that we're really looking for experiences, right? So in order to become a licensed PlayStation developer, you go out to playstation.com/develop, you fill out some forms out there, you'll be contacted by our team and assigned an account manager, at which point you can then request hardware, and you can register your concept for your product. The most important part of all of this, though, is once that happens, don't go off in a black hole, right? Keep in touch with us and maintain contact. Like, that's actually my job. I'm a technical account manager, and one of the key components of my job is managing my accounts and making sure that developers are heard and their needs are satisfied within Sony. All right? So, just to wrap it up here, I did want to point out that as you probably are aware, it's not very easy to sell PSVR or to sell a VR experience even, unless you try it. It's the sort of thing like, I compare it to HD TV, right? It's like you couldn't tell what HD TV really was on a regular definition TV. You had to see it for yourself. And VR is the same sort of thing. So we've made sure that we brought some PSVR demos here to MIGS so you guys could try them out. Yesterday, we were demoing Super Hypercube from Kokoromi and Polytron. Hopefully you had a chance to try that because we're done showing that. Today, we've moved on to a different demo. Today we're showing the Playroom VR from Japan Studio, so that asymmetrical separate screen experience that we were seeing with Monster Escape. That's actually what we're demoing today over in the booth. And then tomorrow, we've got something else that we're going to show. So come on by and check it out. And that's what I've got for you today. So hopefully that was instructive, and you guys are all VR experts now, and you're going to rush out and make the greatest, latest, coolest thing for VR, right? And not make anybody sick, right? All right, cool. And this is my email if anyone wants to contact me. I also have business cards up here as well. Thanks very much.